Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us for this episode of the podcast. It's been a wild week in Canadian politics. We'll delve into all of that in just a second. I'll let you know, coming up later on in the episode, a conversation with author John Fraser. His new book is called The Governors General, An Intimate History of Canada's Highest Office. The people who have held that position, the politicians who put those people there, and maybe some of the ongoing debate around the position itself. And I think certainly there are those who have, unfortunately, dragged down the public perception of the position of Governor General. That's coming up later on. But as mentioned, a wild and honestly kind of a weird week in Canadian politics. I think we're past the point of being surprised by floor crossings. Already we've seen 5 MPs join the Liberals, 1 from the New Democrats, 4 now from the Conservatives. But this latest floor crosser was honestly a bit of a shocker. Now, there have been rumors, and there still are rumors, about Conservatives who are maybe tempted or considering crossing the floor to join the Liberals. I don't think anybody had Marilyn Gladu on their bingo cards. She's a Conservative MP from the Sarnia area in Ontario. She's won successive elections fairly comfortably, honestly, as a Conservative, probably one of the safer Conservative seats in Ontario. And she's not just a Conservative in a big C member of the Conservative Party. She's been a pretty outspoken small C Conservative, social Conservative over the years. I mean, she's been harshly critical lately of how the government has handled the issue of gun control, their decision to appeal, the decision regarding the use of the Emergencies Act. Even going back a bit further, I mean, she was a supporter of the convoy protests. She had criticized vaccines and pandemic response, even to the point where I think the Conservative leader at the time, Erin O'Toole, had pressured her to apologize for some of those comments. She voted against a ban on conversion therapy. I mean, there's kind of a long list of areas where you don't see her as a fit for the Liberal Party of Canada. Not to mention the fact that even just recently, she has criticized others who have crossed the floor. And now here she is doing it herself. So look, there's hypocrisy here. When you criticize floor crossing, you do it yourself. And there's questions about just how principled you are when you're so ardent in opposing the government in so many areas, and then you end up joining them. I mean, same for the Liberals. I mean, what do the Liberals stand for if they're comfortable welcoming in, a new Democrat floor crosser and now a social Conservative like Marilyn Gladu? Do they really need her right now? There's 3 by-elections coming up on Monday. The Liberals are, I think, a slam dunk in 2 of them and a good shot to win the 3rd. I mean, that basically gets them to their majority, even without this latest floor crossing. But maybe Mark Carney is really trying to send a message that, hey, this is a big tent Liberal Party. There's room for even social Conservatives in this big tent party. Does everybody else agree? What about those in that big tent who find themselves more on the left side of the tent? How comfortable are they with this floor crossing? Not to mention some of Mark Carney's agenda anyway. Look, he probably helped save them from defeat in last year's election. And maybe with the NDP going in such a hard left direction under Avi Lewis, maybe they're leery about joining forces with them. But can Mark Carney keep everybody happy? For that matter, can he keep Canadians happy? Liberals seem to be riding high in the polls right now, but doesn't appear as though Mark Carney's tempted to gamble with an early election at this point, especially now if he can kind of get this majority another way. So it was surprising news this week. Honestly, when I saw the first headlines about this floor crossing, thought maybe I had names mixed up, that I was thinking of one MP, but it was somebody else. And then I wondered, is this some leftover April Fool's joke? No, it was real. And then to see them side by side at their first media appearance, it was a little surreal to behold.
And we'll do it officially. So
yes.
This is a handshake in English. Officially to the government caucus and to the Liberal caucus. Marilyn has tremendous experience in business as an engineer, international business experience, and 10 years, 4 elections of experience in Parliament, and one of the most collaborative members of Parliament, working across party lines on important issues, and really dedicated to her electors in Sarnia, Lambton, Baie-Quechua, which I am informed rightly means where the waters meet. and the waters, in my analogy, are meeting in service of Canadians at this crucial time for our country. And I couldn't be happy. I know Minister Solomon, who knows her well and has worked closely with her over the years. We couldn't be happier to have this expertise, experience, and energy coming to our team. So welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be the newest member of our new Liberal government. I've been watching the Prime Minister since he was elected, and the big things that he is driving, nation-building projects, diversifying our trade, bolstering our defense, plans to address criminality and build more homes. These are all the things that Canadians want. These are actually the things that the people of Sarnia, Lambton, Bikeshmandong want. As the Prime Minister mentioned, I worked for decades globally as a chemical engineer and in numerous sectors in very complex supply chains. So I think I have a lot of experience that can help accelerate the government's priorities. Sarnia, Lambton is an economic hub. We have 30% of the petrochemicals in the country, and we have the largest economic traffic across the Blue Water Bridge. And so we need a serious leader who can address the uncertainty that has arrived due to the unjustified American tariffs. We need a global leader with a plan to make a more resilient Canada, a stronger Canada, a more self-reliant Canada for this critical moment. And that man is our Prime Minister, Mark Carney.
So there it was, Mark Carney standing side by side with the newest member of his caucus. Also at that media appearance was Evan Solomon, who used to be a journalist. And in fact, there was one clip that was going around this week from a few years ago where Evan Solomon and Marilyn Gladu had kind of a tense on-air confrontation. Now they are partners in the Liberal caucus. So really interesting political developments. So what does it all mean now moving forward? What does this mean for the Liberals, who seem to basically now have their majority? What does it mean for Pierre Poilievre, who now has to deal with the headache of yet another floor crossing? Rumors of other MPs looking to bolt. Story this week in the Toronto Star quoting anonymous MPs who say they're worried about losing their seat. You know, he's seemed to be riding high after a strong mandate in the Conservative Convention and a real focus on trying to rebrand or soften his image. But now all these political headaches back at the forefront. So joining us for more on what all of this means, very pleased to welcome back to the program, Canadian political writer and analyst Spencer Fernando, much more at his website, spencerfernando.com. Spencer, great to have you back with us here.
Good to be here.
So like I say, maybe a floor crossing in and of itself, not surprising, but this particular MP, how surprised were you by this?
Certainly not who I would expect to be the fourth Conservative to go in that direction. You'd think someone from more of a, I wouldn't say socially progressive, but just less socially conservative, more on the fiscally conservative side, because Carney's more in that direction. But I think it shows that there's certainly a wider range of Conservatives who are unhappy with things within the Conservative Party than I think even the biggest critics of the party thought.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, you know, clearly Marilyn Gladu was unhappy, but I don't know if she's yet elaborated on exactly what led her to this point. Now, she could have just walked away from politics, I suppose, if she was kind of disillusioned with where things are going. But to join the Liberals and to see that she could potentially be a fit in Mark Carney's caucus. So the fact, A, as you say, she's leaving the Conservatives, and B, joining the Liberals. What does that tell us about the two leaders, do you think?
Yeah, well, Carney, I mean, if you look at it from the broad perspective of where the parties are positioned on the political spectrum, you look at Justin Trudeau, he certainly positioned the Liberals more to the center-left, which basically anyone who was center-right or right-wing would feel no place in the Liberal Party. And so that was reflected in the polls. You know, Poilievre was more of a center-right leader, so he had a larger share of the electorate once people got tired of Trudeau and saw Trudeau as too progressive. With Carney, he's moved the Liberals to the center on a wide range of issues. If you look at the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax gets rid of that, more supportive of the oil and gas sector, military buildup, you know, immigration reductions, tougher on crime. So if you're a center-right person or even a right-leaning person, there's much less that Carney's doing that would make you angry and that would push you away from the Liberal Party. And so if you're an MP and you're thinking, well, there's not as big a difference between the two parties as there used to be. The Liberals seem like they're more well-run. The Conservatives are having some dysfunction issues, clearly, with internal disputes and people leaving. And then you think, okay, well, if you actually want to be a part of the government and part of, working on the issues facing Canada from the inside as opposed to the outside, then floor crossing is not a bad option, clearly, for some of these people.
It's funny too, because I mean, this riding seems to be like a fairly safe Conservative seat, so there would, on the surface, appear to be a political risk for Marilyn Gladu in defecting to the Liberals. I believe it was journalist Paul Wells who pointed out, though, this was once a seat held by Roger Galloway, who was a Liberal MP, but was actually seen as a real social conservative, even opposed same-sex marriage at the time. So we're not used to seeing that, I think, in the Liberal Party as of late, especially under Justin Trudeau. But what does it tell us about the viability of a Liberal who's, center-right or conservative in many ways?
Yeah, well, I think Carney already said that she's not going to be voting, against abortion or anything like that within the Liberal Party. I don't see the Conservatives bringing that issue up either, so it's really a non-starter politically for any party, really. But, I think it's just Carney turning the Liberals back into more of a brokerage party. You position the Liberals right in the center of the political spectrum. You can get someone from the center left, get someone from the center right. I mean, you had the NDP MP in Nunavut, who is clearly more on the center left, who's joined the Liberals as well, right? So he's bringing from a wide range of people. And again, I think a big part of this is the external threat that many Canadians feel we face from the hostility of the Trump administration, right? That creates, if you look at history, whenever countries are in a war or face an external threat, you do get more of a kind of emergency unity government or national unity government of some kind. Canada doesn't have that officially. There's still the NDP and Conservatives are not part of the government. But unofficially, Carney's starting to put together something that kind of resembles that, with people on the center left, center right, and the center all working together.
Yeah, and I think that dynamic and the other fact is that, look, if it's not the Liberals, it's the Conservatives, right? I mean, it's really, for the most part, those are the only two parties that could theoretically or conceivably hold power. Is that enough to keep the Liberals happy? Because, look, Mark Carney inherited Justin Trudeau's caucus. There are a lot of MPs who probably aren't necessarily comfortable being caucus mates with someone like Marilyn Gladu. But at this point, are they likely to be tempted to cause trouble or to look to the NDP, for example?
I think if the NDP had elected a different leader, possibly Heather McPherson, maybe Rob Ashton, I think the way they've gone with Abby Lewis so far to the left, if you're a center left Liberal, that probably seems like too much for you. And so I think that in a way that kind of helps Carney, as much as he's going to be criticized a lot from the left by Abby Lewis. He's also helped by the NDP being so clearly a left-wing party and not as much a center-left party. So it gives him more room politically. I think what's also happening too is Carney wants to do some things that I think, as you say, he's got leftovers from Justin Trudeau's era. He wants to do things that a lot of people from that era would not want to do. I think he is sincere about wanting to get a pipeline built. From what I've heard, I've read articles where he said, separatism in Alberta has to be taken seriously. The government can't just wish it away. So I think he's very determined to try to do something about that and show a more supportive approach from the federal government, which we already saw with the Alberta-Canada MOU. But he faces internal resistance. So I think each center-right or even right-wing, in Gladu's case, MP that he can add reduces the leverage of a center-left or really left-wing MP from the Trudeau era. So he's buying himself a little bit of room.
It's interesting. I mean, the Conservatives, on the one hand, have accused Mark Carney of trying to cobble together a majority any way he can. And they also, at the same time, have criticized him for being tempted to go to the polls early. And certainly if you look at opinion polls, you could see why that might be a temptation for the Liberals. But based on what we've seen in recent weeks and these floor crossings, do you think the Liberals are content to try to get to a majority and put an election off for a while?
I think so. I think, Carney's someone who would run a cost-benefit analysis, and he's in power right now, and he's most likely going to get a majority, especially now with the latest floor crossing. And he just needs 2 by-elections now. 2 are basically in guaranteed Liberal seats. One is a seat that was basically a tie, so that's a toss-up. But if you go to an election, then who knows? Elections are unpredictable. When you're in power, it's predictable. When you're in an election, it's unpredictable. You're giving up power for the prospect of maybe getting more, but you can end up with none. And so I think if it's true that there are at least another, 9 to 10 Conservative MPs who are considering crossing, I wouldn't be surprised to see more of them cross over after the election and then Carney after the by-elections. And then Carney buys himself even more room. And then if you have a 4 or 5 seat majority, you're not too worried. You can lose one person who, if they're ill, they can't make it to a vote, or you can lose one person who retires. A 1 or 2 seat majority, very, very tenuous. But I think it's, and this is the other, maybe we'll discuss it too, but, the criticism of the floor crossings has been the undemocratic nature of it. And sure, I can understand people make that argument, but as you say, the polls show that if voters could go to the polls, they'd probably elect a Liberal majority. So to say it's undemocratic for the Liberals to get a majority when it looks like that's what voters would vote for doesn't really hold water.
Yeah, this debate around floor crossing is not new, and I think both parties have benefited from it, and both parties have criticized it. So there was some hypocrisy there. I think in the case of Marilyn Gladu, and it's easy enough to look at her recent statements where she's slammed the government over appealing the Emergencies Act decision, or slamming the government over gun control, or other issues, that she's certainly not been shy about criticizing this government, or even for that matter, criticizing other floor crossers. So what do we make of this hypocrisy, and what do you make of calls to have some kind of rules in place, or even a ban around this?
Yeah, I don't think there should be a ban, nor do I think there should be a requirement for an automatic by-election. And the key reason is, I know people say, well, yes, we technically vote for people, but most people feel like they're voting for a party. Okay, people could feel what they want, but the technical nature of the system is what matters. That's how the system is built, and it was built that way for a reason. I think party leaders are already far too powerful. You can, if you're the party leader, you can say, well, I don't like this MP, so their nomination paper isn't getting signed. So that's not that democratic. Party leaders are elected by a very small portion of the public who join their political party and vote in the leadership race, not even anything close to a majority of the public. So it's not like a party leader can say that their partisan mandate is a representation of the majority of people. And so, we elect individuals. Individuals run under party banners. But if you were to make it either ban floor crossing or make people have to go to a by-election, what you'd be doing is entrenching the power of the party leaders who are already too powerful. And then what incentive does a party leader have to treat their colleagues well? Just treat everybody like garbage and people can't go anywhere. We talk a lot about free market competition being good for the economy. I also think it's good in Parliament. Different leaders have an incentive to create a good environment for the people who've been elected, to be a good leader, to listen to different ideas, to include different perspectives, to show flexibility when events demand it. And part of that is knowing that if you treat your people badly or you don't listen to them, some of them are going to leave. And so, if you're worried about that, I think the time to worry about that is in the candidate vetting and recruitment stage. And so, but to say that it should be banned or restricted or have to go to a by-election, I think would just make party leaders too powerful. And I think that's already a bit of a problem in our system.
Well, certainly this Conservative leader is having to fret about MPs leaving, 4 now, as mentioned. And like you alluded to, there's still rumors about others. So this all comes, Pierre Poilievre gets that mandate at the Conservative Convention, a real concerted effort to try to soften his image or show a different side. But once again, questions around his leadership. I don't know. What do you make of his situation right now?
Well, it's a tough situation. I think, I wrote something recently and people read the headline or part of an article and then make their opinion of it without reading the whole article. And I talked about how, I felt for a long time how he's needed to do a better job differentiating his brand and the conservative brand from Donald Trump. And people read that, they're like, oh, you're saying he's the same as Donald Trump. I explicitly say he's not, but there's a perception a lot of people have that he is, which has harmed him. I think, unfortunately, he's done a lot of the right things, but he's done them too late at every step. And so, during the election campaign, they started to get a little bit tougher on Trump 2 or 3 weeks after they should have. And then he's pivoted his image to be a little bit more reasonable, a little less partisan, reaching out to, he's talking more to everybody, which is good. He's talking to people like Joe Rogan, and he's going on CBC more. He's getting his message out to everybody. That was good. Probably needed to happen, quite a while ago. And so I think the challenge he faces is one, Carney is not Trudeau. Trudeau was so easy to run against. He became extremely unpopular. He was very stubborn. Trudeau would double down on an idea that people didn't like just for the sake of doubling down. So it's easy to run and fundraise against someone like that. Carney's very different. Carney would have said, well, this policy's not working, so I abandon it, right? Abandons the carbon tax. Poilievre campaigned for years on axe the tax. Carney gets in first day. Okay, it's axed. Next, just all the momentum just dissipates. And so I think Poilievre's struggling to adjust to that. And then I think, the party's become a little bit of a closed information ecosystem, which I think is really harming. A lot of the right-wing influencers on Twitter, they get a lot of retweets. They're good at going after people. They get a lot of views. But, getting even, say you get 200,000 views on Twitter, well, let's say half of them are in Canada. That's one riding, basically, right? So to assume that doing well on social media means doing well in the country doesn't really hold up. And so I think the Conservatives have been kind of trapped in the social media world, the closed information ecosystem they're in, and then just an overly cautious approach. They do everything, but they have to pull on focus group and think, and then it's months too late, and then voters have already moved on.
I'm sympathetic to the notion that more time might actually be good for Pierre Poilievre. If Carney's content to govern for another year or two, maybe that works for Pierre Poilievre. But you see what's happening right now with rumors of more floor crossings. Then you had a bunch of MPs anonymously talking to the Toronto Star how they're worried about losing their seat. With all of this going on and him being undermined from within, can he survive another year, do you think?
Yeah, the drip, drip, drip nature of it is very devastating for him. He has a few good weeks with the Rogan interview, the Diary of a CEO interview, better communications, and then boom, another floor crossing. So that basically gets wiped out, and it resets a negative news cycle for him. And so, if I were in his position, I would almost go to the people in your caucus and say, here's a pledge. I mean, you can't, it's not legal, of course, to force them, but here's a pledge. Either you're in right now or you want to leave. If it's 20 people want to leave, better to get that over with in one really horrible day than to have 20 people leave over the next year, right? And so I think that's the challenge. But there's kind of a deeper issue where there's very little introspection, I notice, from a lot of people, partisans in the Conservative Party lately, especially on social media, which never much introspection there anyway. But there's very much this attitude of, it's everybody else's fault. The voters are manipulated. The media is lying to people. Oh, it's Trump derangement syndrome. Oh, it's irrational. Oh, it's this or that. Look, a party's job is to win elections. And if a party can't win an election and then can't compete with Mark Carney and then can't convince its own people to stay in the party, then at some point they have to look and say, what are we doing wrong here? What should we be working on? And there's still not much of a willingness to do that, I notice.
The Conservatives might just wish we could skip ahead to 2029 because, the Trump factor isn't going away. And clearly that resonates with Canadians, kind of galvanizes Canadians in a unity sense. You've been writing this week where things are going with NATO and Trump really ramping up the anti-NATO rhetoric. Of course, we're supposed to have CUSMA renegotiations this year, and who knows what's going to happen there as Trump gets, I think, all the more volatile and unpredictable. How much is that affecting the political landscape in Canada?
Well, it's huge. And I think, it's something Conservatives have struggled to grapple with. I wrote an article for the Hub, I think before the election, a month or so, somewhere around there. It feels like a long time ago. But I said, Canadian Conservatives need to, distance themselves from Donald Trump. And, people were like, oh, well, they're not the same, blah, blah, blah. Fine. Okay. I know they're different parties. I know Poilievre is very different. But it's voter perception that matters in this case, if voters feel something. And what's happening is Donald Trump is the most famous and prominent advocate for a right-wing Conservative Party in the Western world. And that filters down to people's perception of every other right-wing party. And so, unless you completely differentiate yourself and explain why you're different from that, some of that's going to leak onto your own party and it's going to damage your party. It's a corrosive substance, basically. And, every time Trump threatens Canada, it kind of recreates the rally around the flag effect, right? Which you see in times of conflict. People, it's a psychological factor. People want to support their leader. Trudeau even became more popular, went up about 10 points in the polls, still from a super low bar, but became more popular when Trump started calling him governor and threatening Canada. And so that cycle resets every time Trump threatens Canada. And there's just a deeper moral issue where Trump, he acts in such a way, the threats against Iran, right? Not I'm going to take out the Iranian regime, but a civilization is going to die. And you're basically saying that's every Iranian. And so people see that, and it deepens the sense of, in many cases, disgust or just complete, lack of acceptance for that. And people understandably then look and say, what's the least like Donald Trump in Canada? And then you have Mark Carney, a centrist banker, technocratic, very calm, very reasonable, very different from Donald Trump. And so it helps his brand in that way. But, again, this is the problem, the closed ecosystem I mentioned. The conservative influencers, they will just say, oh, well, it's Canada's fault that there's a problem with the U.S., kind of like what Jamil Javani said, right? Blamed it on Canada. It's Canada's fault. Oh, it's just Trump derangement syndrome. Oh, Trump won't be there in 2029. Well, 2029 is a long time away. And so, it's not tomorrow. And so it's an inability to grapple with why Canadians dislike Donald Trump, how Trump negatively affects center-right parties, including the Conservative Party, and the deeper moral aspect of why so many Canadians want the opposite of whatever Trump is offering. And I think as long as Conservatives keep thinking, oh, it's just going to go away, then they're not going to make any changes and it's not going to improve for them.
I think the risk for Mark Carney, though, in all of this is, of course, Donald Trump has provided the impetus to say things got to change. We got to think big. We got to act big, right? We really need to take bold swings to bolster the economy. And again, I think that's resonated with Canadians. But at a certain point, I think he's got to be able to show results. I think Canadians still like the rhetoric. They like the approach. And maybe it's still relatively early on in this term. But at some point, does Mark Carney really need to start showing results here?
Absolutely. And this is, I think, the biggest problem he faces is that, as you mentioned, with the Trudeau era leftovers, there's a lot of ideological opposition to the things that need to be done to improve the country within the Liberal Party. I'm sure if Mark Carney could switch half of the Liberal caucus for half of the Conservative caucus, same amount of MPs, but switch them, I bet you he probably would. Because the things you're going to need to do to get pipelines built quickly, that's going to create opposition among environmentalist groups, a lot of groups who, people like Stephen Guilbeault, who are very supportive of. And so that's going to create tension within the Liberal coalition as well. Then he's going to have Abby Lewis criticizing him from the left on all those issues. Spending reductions, public service reductions. I mean, basically, if you look at the last budget, it represents a significant shift of funding from the bureaucracy and from general government spending to defense spending, which generally is a very right-wing thing to do, right? So you're spending less basically everywhere else and you're shifting spending to the military. And so that creates opposition, which again has been tempered by the fact that most of the Liberal MPs owe their jobs to Mark Carney's personal popularity. They were all going to lose, they were going to end up maybe 30, 40 seats. So most of them know they're there because of him. But again, that doesn't last forever. They've got their own independent minds. They've got their own views, and they're not going to forever put up with something they don't agree with. And so trying to balance that could just lead to political paralysis for Carney, right? Where he keeps saying the right things, but can't get anything done. And at some point that will weigh on his popularity. So I think that's part of his strategy with getting center-right floor crossers as well, is he's buying himself some of the ideological space to do things that upsets a part of the Liberal coalition, but gives them still enough MPs to get things passed.
Well, next up, as mentioned, these 3 by-elections Monday, which could potentially cinch this Liberal majority. We'll see how that all plays out. Much more on all of this, as mentioned, SpencerFernando.com. Spencer, appreciate the insight. Thanks for making some time for us here.
No problem.
All right. Our thanks once again to political writer and commentator Spencer Fernando. Again, SpencerFernando.com is his website. So some interesting points he makes about where things stand politically in Canada, what the significance is of this floor crossing, and where this all is headed. The debate around floor crossing is an interesting one, and I don't think anything's going to change. I mean, I'm kind of with him on the idea that I don't think that we should ban this or have rules in place against floor crossing, or even the idea that it should automatically trigger a by-election. Now, I think some floor crossings are greasier than others. Some might seem a little more opportunistic than others, or just flat out more cynical than others. But I think there are circumstances where it's more justifiable, where it's understandable. But at the end of the day, I mean, the voters should be the ones to have a say. And what's interesting, too, is in more recent political history, floor crossers have not done well the next time they have to go back and face the voters. This riding around Sarnia that Marilyn Gladu represents will be an interesting test, because it would seem to be a pretty safe Conservative riding. But at the same time, it was previously a Liberal riding, and Roger Galloway, who we talked about, who had held that seat, was kind of a social conservative, at least in a Liberal context. So maybe there is an appetite for that kind of a politician. So we'll see how voters in that riding judge this floor crossing, and same with the others. Now, you could make an argument maybe that voter recall is a way of addressing that, where, it's not an automatic by-election, but if voters feel strongly enough, it could potentially trigger one. Now, it turned into a bit of a gong show in Alberta with recall as of late. But I think if you sort of put some parameters around recall, and this could be one of the legitimate reasons for a voter recall, that might be doable. And it'd be curious to see in any of these cases if there would be enough of a groundswell in those ridings to force a recall vote or force a by-election. But I mean, it's all theoretical right now. Like I say, I don't think anything's going to change because the same parties that criticize it when they're not benefiting from this are the same parties that are okay with it when they do benefit. And we've seen that in the past, and I suspect we'll probably see it in the future. So I don't think that part's going to change. But I guess the question now, are we going to see more floor crossings? And what does it mean for the Liberals? What does it mean for the Conservatives and their leadership? So we'll see what the coming weeks and months bring us. All right, I want to turn our attention to another important position in our system of government, that being the Governor General. The Governor General is not the head of state, of course. The Governor General is the representative of the head of state. Canada's head of state is the Queen, or the King, as we now have, of Canada, who also happens to be based in the United Kingdom, is British. And I think that whole aspect does seem confusing to Canadians, and by extension, the position of Governor General itself. As mentioned, I mean, as the Constitution spells out, King Charles is the King of Canada, and the Governor General is the King's representative in Canada. Of course, the Governor General is appointed by the Prime Minister, and basically the monarch traditionally just kind of signs off on that. So you can't really have one without the other. If we're going to maintain our system of being a constitutional monarchy, then you sort of need that position there. Now, I suppose there has been more broadly a debate around keeping the monarchy. You know, keep in mind how difficult it would be to reopen the Constitution to change all of that. Maybe some Canadians have become a little disillusioned with it. And perhaps part of that stems from frustration or disillusionment with the position of Governor General itself, the cost of that position, and some of the recent controversies around those who have held that position. I don't think that's helped. And for that matter, the political decisions that went into appointing some of those people in the first place. But there are at the same time, though, some really interesting stories around those who have held this position and some important contributions that they have made. This is all the subject of a fascinating new book by somebody who has followed all of this very closely. In fact, has known or met all of the Canadian-born governors general. The book is called The Governors General, An Intimate History of Canada's Highest Office. Very pleased to be joined by the author of that book. John Fraser is a journalist, a writer, an academic. He is founding president of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada. John Fraser, so great to have you with us here.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Rob.
As I say, it's a book about the individuals who have held this position, but in a way it's about the position itself, right? Why it matters, the role it plays, because I think, as I said, and you've alluded to in the book as well, that it is maybe a misunderstood or underappreciated role in the Canadian system.
It certainly is misunderstood, and it's certainly underappreciated. That's because we're not chest thumpers. We come to live in a country that is evolved rather than revolted. And we live right next to an enormous country that has a very powerful cultural influence on us. And I think we tend to think somehow it has a more exciting political life. Thanks to President Trump, that's being put into some perspective. And the quiet evolutionary process of Canada looks pretty good at the moment. Part of that process is an evolved head of state, which is ceremonial rather than active. The interesting thing, I think, always have thought that the Americans had the revolution in the middle of the 18th century, and the only model they had for a head of state was a Hanoverian monarch, a guy named George III. And so what they did was they made that office, the office of the king, presidential, that it had to be voted indirectly. And so through 2 or 3 centuries, they have basically reelected George III every 4 years with all the powers that an 18th century monarch had. Whereas under the Westminster system, it's evolved to a powerless head of state in the sense that it's ceremonial and does the dignified part of running a country, giving out honors, making people feel good about what they're doing. And the actual gritty political life is handled in Parliament. And there's 2 pluses there. One is that we don't have to hang our heads in shame when our head of state goes off crazy. They either abdicate or we just forget about them. The other thing is that the opposition doesn't disappear after an election. It's really interesting that in Canada, an opposition still has a position, the loyal opposition, which is tied to the crown. And in the States, who's heard of Kamala Harris since that election? Although she had half the vote of the country. Interesting contrast. And I think Canadians are now looking at their institutions. And my luck is I've got a book out on the Governors General, as you say, often misunderstood or underappreciated, at a time when maybe there's a bit more open mind to look at it.
It's interesting because I think, certain individuals elevate the office. I think at the same time, certain individuals have called the office into question. So as you sort of go through each of them, it's interesting to look at their story and look at the impact they had. And what's fascinating about it from your perspective, you've known or met all of them, at least those that are Canadian-born governors general.
I have. The first one was Vincent Massey, and I met him when I was a young teenager through a bizarre story that's at the beginning of the book. It was quite amusing. But I also came to run a college that he started. So his life was put in front of my face from a whole bunch of different angles. He was a schoolboy incident in my life, and then he became someone who I looked deeply into his sense of his dream. He produced so much in this country that we're not really that aware of. It's not just my college, Massey College, and Harthouse at the University of Toronto. He's responsible for the Canada Council, for the Order of Canada, for all sorts of institutions like the Massey Lectures, and it's just part of the soul of Canada that this strange little guy who became Governor General was responsible for, and then his family's money.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Canadians know these names. I mean, as you mentioned, the name Massey, I think, is well known. The name Vanier is very well known.
Yeah.
So there have certainly been some figures who have held this position who really loomed large when it comes to Canadian history and Canadian culture, even if Canadians aren't intimately familiar with the individuals themselves.
That's right. And they won't know some of the other names. The cycle of appointments go from quite well-known names who were big figures in diplomacy and army to a period where there were basically unwanted politicians that Prime Minister wanted to get rid of. What a lot of Canadians don't understand who question the system or wonder how it comes about is that although the Governor General is appointed, he's appointed by a system that is elected. That's the Prime Minister recommending to the Sovereign, who always accepts the recommendation, who should be the Governor General, our ceremonial head of state, who represents the Sovereign. And so the quality of the people that occupy the position have to do with the quality of the Prime Minister and his or her concept of the job and what they want that person to represent.
Yeah, I mean, it is a role that does have some power assigned to it, but that's not frequently used. So, we even have to go back 100 years or so to talk about the King-Byng affair, or the October crisis. You detail that in the book, or the prorogation, the coalition drama of 2008. So these moments have arisen from time to time where there's a decision to be made by a governor general, an opportunity where you see that the role isn't just ceremonial.
It's true. There is some residual structures that actually come into play. And you mentioned the prorogation business that happened between Madame Jeanne was the Governor General and Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister. But there's another, and so that remnant of power exists. But more importantly, I think, is the Governor General, depending on the type of person who gets it, has an extraordinary platform if they know how to deploy it. You can take a Governor General like Monsieur LeBlanc, who basically he had problems. We now know that actually he had the onset of dementia when he got the job. He managed it okay, but there's nothing much to be said except something rather funny. But someone like Madam Clarkson, Adrienne Clarkson, who knew how to take that position almost to the edge of controversy, but knew what to do and knew the things that could be done by an active Governor General trying to arouse a sense of Canada in people, and to make people feel good about themselves, and to give some focus, which she did so amazingly at the return of the unknown soldier. Put all of her speech in the book because it was so memorable. So that's kind of the range. You can sort of sleepwalk through the job, and no one even knows you're there, or you can be quite active. And if you're very active, you have to be careful not to trespass on elected toes, because that's kind of a no-go area for a governor general. But usually they know the rules of the game. Usually,
Yes.
not always.
So let's talk about Justin Trudeau. As you say, it's ultimately the elected politicians who make the decision to appoint the governor general. Justin Trudeau has had a major impact, I think, on recent history around this position, both in terms of how he used a former governor general, that being David Johnston, and as you talk about in the book, the very consequential decision to appoint Julie Payette as governor general. So how do we assess the prime minister's role, and maybe how Canadians perceive this position now?
So really interesting point to look at. Let me first of all start with David Johnston. David Johnston got the job because Stephen Harper had a better concept, I thought, of how to choose a governor general, and he had a committee created to get input from people in the know and people that would go out and ask questions. What he didn't want to give up his right to recommend someone to the king or the queen, as it was then, but he wanted somebody thoroughly vetted, so that if you get a choice of 5 people across a broad spectrum of interests and background, then he could have some confidence in who he would choose. And that was how Mr. Johnson got the job. Came as a process of elimination, but of thorough vetting. Now, I thought so much of that system. I got involved in it a bit with some vice-regal committees, but I recommended. I told the story in the book. There was a senior advisor to Mr. Trudeau, as he was then, named Jerry Butts, and I said, you may not like Mr. Harper or his politics, but he had a good idea to make a better way of going about creating a governor general. And I told him all that. And he said to me, yeah, they're pretty proud of that system, but we think we can do better. And better turned out to be Julie Payette. So the trouble there was, I would say, Mr. Trudeau's impulsiveness. In many ways, we were very happy to have him as a prime minister, as I remember the early days, not the end days. He was young and it was refreshing and the name resonated. But he definitely was someone who didn't probe deeply into some of his appointments. And most of his troubles actually are rooted in the fact that he didn't see things through to their possible complications. But one of the real ones was Julie Payette, because she, on one level, she was an amazing person. She was a young woman from a working class background in Quebec who had survived in the whole alpha male world of engineering and space discovery, and got into space twice, and was charming and as far as one could see, and a woman and francophone, all that looked wonderful for the next day's headline. But it only took the Toronto Star about, I say 4 nanoseconds, a short time, to discover that she had some traffic in her background. She'd spent a night in jail because she'd gone after her ex-husband with a violent instrument. She'd, albeit accidentally, but nevertheless, she'd run down a homeless person and killed them. And she had a completely toxic reputation when she was the head of the Montreal Science Center. All of that could have been found out completely easily, so that when officials in the PMO said, yes, they did do their due diligence with poor old Julie Payette, you knew they hadn't done anything. Nothing. Zip. They had looked at what the next day's headline was going to look like, which they thought was good. And boy, did we all have to suffer for that. And to me, it was a tragedy. This was a notable and important Canadian who got thrust in the wrong job, and it all blew up in everyone's face.
Well, and yeah, I think as you say, there were some red flags there that the government should have paid attention to, or the prime minister should have paid attention to. But ultimately, once she's in that position, I mean, she bears some responsibility for her decisions and how she
Yes.
approached it.
Yep.
Where did things really go off the rails for her, do you think?
I think the first strong hint that we were in trouble was when she sort of thought she could say anything she wanted, including belittling people who were anti-vaccine. I mean, I might think those people are wrong and stupid and not looking at science, but it's not for a Governor General to say something like that. These are her people too. And she also belittled anyone who still had a sense of faith, had some sense of the metaphysical in life. And that's not what a Governor General is there for. It's not to belittle some of the citizens or show preference for some citizens over others. You're there for all Canadians. The biggest problem this poor lady had was she thought the job was about her and her fame, and it wasn't in the end. The job's about the country and what the country needs, and so that disconnect led to a lot of a misunderstanding. And her background, I think I said in the book, she was made for space. She was made for all the skills that you need to have as a great engineer and a physicist and a decision maker. And on Earth, she was like a caged lioness. She just felt the horrible restraints of what that office implies.
Yeah, and then we had the spectacle of essentially a governor general being fired, which we hadn't seen before. How much damage did all of that do to the institution, do you think?
Well, at the moment it did a lot of damage. On the other hand, I take a bizarre view of all these things. It actually got people looking at the position, and I thought that was a good thing. I despair of our schools and our public system of education that has let so many young people come through both their grade school and their high school and the university without actually knowing how their country is run, unless they show a specific interest. So when something like that happens, it is a teaching opportunity. I started an institute to study the Crown in Canada because no one could understand how we have a British monarch at the head of our country, because no one knows our history. And no one understands the compromises that were there. Harper told me something interesting when I interviewed him. He said, it came about because of a book I'd written. He said that he was like most Canadians. He never really paid much attention to the Crown or Governor Generals or the Sovereign until he had high office. And then he saw that it was useful, but much more importantly, every alternative he considered scared the living bejesus out of him. And that's before Canadians say, why do we have a foreign sovereign for our king? Think of the alternatives. Think what you want to do and how it can be done. If all Canadians were in a majority and just didn't want this system, it's just a matter of getting 10 legislatures in the provinces and 2 in the territories to all agree on something. And you and I, Rob, both know the possibility of that happening in our lifetime is nil. And my view is, if that's the case, we've got this system, let's make it work. And in Canada, there is the added plus that the treaty relationships we have with the Indigenous community are something that are tied to the Crown and the office of Governor General and to the office of the Sovereign in a way unique and if handled properly, a way to help us get past some of the ordeal that we've all been putting ourselves through the last couple of decades. Because we emphasize a treaty relationship and an equality that was there a while ago and that we're working towards trying to get back.
Well, and that was, I guess, part of the rationale for appointing the current Governor General, Mary
Yes.
Simon, of course, who has Indigenous background. But I think, to a lot of Canadians, she's kind of been invisible. The strength that was supposed to be a strength we haven't really seen that in terms of advancing that conversation. And I think we see a lot of the weaknesses, including, of course, her lack of French language skills. What have you made of her tenure so far?
I'm afraid she's a good person and has done positive things in her life, and she has a charming husband with the name of Fraser, so of course I've got to be careful about that. But I'm afraid I called her the grim prioress of Rideau Hall, because she has been a one-track Governor General. She's focused, not exclusively, but consistently on the Indigenous issues that we're dealing with, and that is in effect giving us a Governor General who, for non-Indigenous Canadians, is constantly stoking a guilt factor, which is the wrong thing to be doing for a Governor General. Canadians, believe me, know how to guilt themselves over past wrongs. We're world leaders on that, but that's not what we need from a Governor General. And so, this Governor General on that issue had an extraordinary platform to try and bring people together, and she just hasn't. She's not a bad person or anything like that, but she has been either just so opaque that we haven't a clue what she actually thinks, or she's been so consistently on her one issue that she thinks that got her propelled in that office that it's to the exclusion of other things. She's done she's done the job of handing out medals and shaking hands, fine, but that's just costume jewelry stuff. The real thing of a Governor General is how do they represent the country to itself.
So whether it's Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre or somebody else who appoints the next Governor General, what advice would you have for that Prime Minister?
Well, I'm afraid I did a Globe Mail article, and I gave him advice, and I said it should be someone, first of all, there's basic checklist, right? Can they speak the 2 official languages? Do they have, what kind of, is the background? Would you please check the police files first? Would you please, would you look at stuff that's been said these days? We're getting close to the time when anybody who's going to be Governor General will have an internet past. We're not quite there, but we will be soon enough. How does that look? There's all sorts of checks that have to be done. And once you've done that, how do they communicate? It's not that you need an actor, but you need someone that has sincerity and most of all, do have a sense that they understand the nature of the job. Not that they're so wonderful that they can be considered, but that they have a sense of the country. Because in the end, as I've said before on the show and in the book, it's not about the person that gets in it. It's about the country, and will they serve the country well? And it's not about the headline the next day either.
You remain optimistic then that this institution has a solid, even dare we say, a bright future?
I have. Part of it's for negative reasons, is I don't think Canadians have a clue how to change it constitutionally. I've got faith in that. And the other thing is, it can be transformed almost overnight with a good appointment. I mean, I'm hoping. I think it's take the United States longer to survive what they've been going through, and they will be going through for the next 2 years. But there's always a new dawn. I mean, and an adroit appointment coming up could do wonders for Canada, especially at a time when we want our institutions to be strong and upfront, and things to be something that we can cling to and embrace, put on our shoulders, that sort of thing.
Well, the book is called The Governors General, An Intimate History of Canada's Highest Office. John Fraser, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Rob, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay, so there you go. That was John Fraser. As mentioned, he's a journalist, a writer, an academic, founding president of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada, talking about his new book, The Governors General, An Intimate History of Canada's Highest Office. Our thanks as well to political writer and commentator Spencer Fernando, and what's been a really interesting week in Canadian politics. That's where we will leave it for this episode of The Rob Breakenridge Show. Don't forget, you can find this podcast on YouTube, also on your regular podcast platforms, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and the rest, and much more at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this week. Again, my name is Rob Breakenridge. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, and we will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.